Okay, hello everyone. Hi. My name is Katie Freeman. I'm Executive Publicist at Riverhead Books, and this is actually my first time doing this, and I'm doing it because I love Jessie's novel so much. Jessie's novel is published by the Unnamed Press out in LA, and I was just so moved by it and very honored that she asked me to have this conversation with her. And I'm so thrilled that you all could come out tonight. Look at this. This is a fantastically full room. Look at all of you. This is a remarkable, entrancing debut, and I'm going to just describe it a little bit so that those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet have some context for the conversation that we're going to have about it. The book opens with Hannah, a 29-year-old American in Florence, trying to rebuild her life after a shattering breakdown from an illness. As Claire Massoud describes, Hannah is far from home, unseen, unknown, estranged even from her body, in the most literal sense, in ecstasy. In Florence, Hannah joins a rowing club, begins to find a place for herself, and tentatively opens herself up to being seen and known. But her illness, which in this case is anorexia, remains with and a part of her, and as she begins to explore the saints of Italy, her relationship with her body stands on a precipice of different kinds of desires. An aching, deeply felt debut, this is a novel that speaks to how we understand our place in the world, what it means to hold on to complex truths about who we are, and how hard we have to struggle sometimes to trust each other and trust ourselves. So before we begin our conversation, I'm going to ask Jessie to read the prologue because I want you all to have a feel for the rhythm and the emotion of the sentences that she creates. So she's going to open up the novel for us with a few pages.
Thank you so much, Katie. This morning is every morning. I've been here almost a month, and still I wake too frequently, too early, to the buzz of mosquitoes, gray light, and the window shutters swinging open and closed. I wake from violent dreams filled with strong winds and slamming doors, bodies thrown against windows loose in their frames, frames loose in their sleeves. I wake in Florence, afraid. The shutters swing open, and each time I catch just a glimpse of the Palazzo Vecchio's tower against violet sky before they swing closed again. The image is familiar now. This empty apartment is mine. Still, this is not quite life. On this morning, I relight the citronella coil and walk to the window. In the alley, a man puts on a magenta helmet, climbs onto a moped, and pulls out onto Via Malinchini, the last to leave the bar below. Once he's gone, there are only the birds that shoot past my window like darts thrown screaming from an unseen hand. It is feeding time. I walk to the bathroom, pull my t-shirt up over my head, let my pants drop to the floor, and drag the orange scale away from the wall. It rattles against the blue tiles, catching in each valley. I adjust the needle to 0. Not cheating, never cheating, I watch the numbers spin like a slot machine until they stop, predictably. It's good, I say aloud, running my hand along my face, my arm, my stomach. It's good, I repeat, overly decisive and sober, trying to coax my reflection into agreement. Today, I think, as I dress, tie back my hair, and climb the 3 stone steps to the kitchen, will be different. I open the long slatted doors and step out onto the small balcony, which is so steeply pitched it feels like it may topple into the courtyard below. It is the end of August. For weeks, the other windows have been quiet and dark, except for the apartment across the way and 1 floor down, where an old woman sits all day, her arms spreading on the sill. She is sometimes staring out, sometimes cooking sauce I can smell as steam climbs out and over the terracotta roofs. But even her window is vacant this morning. The Italians have fled the cities for the coast, and all over Florence there are handwritten signs taped to shop doors. The type of scrawl that normally says, back in 5, only in this case it's back next month. The signs do not deter the tourists who fill the piazza around the Duomo, who line up at dawn to be the first into the Uffizi Gallery, who haggle and hassle at the Central Market, who shout at the buses that lumber down the narrow streets and heed no one, who walk the bridges with gelato dripping down their hands in the evenings watching Italian bands playing the Beatles. A manic, frenzied movement, repeated day after day, night after night. They are looking up, always up at the frescoed ceilings of churches, at the parade of Madonnas in museums, at the oversized head, hands, and feet of the David, at the performers dressed as mummies who move only at the sound of money in their jars, at the buildings edged in angels that circle and circle. I am no different. I still cannot cross Piazza della Signoria at night without looking up to the golden lion at the top of the Palazzo Vecchio, to the harsh glare of Neptune who rules the fountain outside, to the writhing sculptures in the loggia at the piazza's corner. Lit from below, the Sabine woman twists and twists out of the grasp of her attacker, all that stone tapering from the massive base to the single point of her finger reaching toward the sky. There is something more, it says.
I'm so glad that you got to hear that opening, perhaps for the first time, some of you. I have a lot of friends who are writers, and it's very anxiety-producing for me to read a friend's book because you never know how you're going to feel about it, and sometimes then you have to feel in a very public way one way or the other. And I knew... And I admire Jessie enormously, and so I was particularly anxious in starting this book, and I knew from those first pages that I was absolutely in and that I was going to love what was going to come next. So I'm glad that you all heard this tonight. I wanted to just start with that as a general opening question, which is, did you know, you mentioned that you've been working on the book for a decade. Did you know how it was going to start, and does it look now like it did when you first imagined it into being?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I began the book in another class with Lindsay Abrams, a narrative structure class, where we were given the assignment of writing the first chapter and a description of a novel we would never write. And I wrote the opening of this novel and part of the first chapter with the idea of it being about a woman's a woman who is struggling with an eating disorder, her interior experience, a woman who is kind of on the fringes and an outsider in one way or another. And though I had an eating disorder in mind, it was my hope that it would be a kind of story that could speak to anybody who has ever lost themselves and had to kind of rebuild from that wreckage. So I wrote the very opening in the first chapter, and then I decided that I wanted to keep going. And from there, I had that sort of core in mind, a woman searching for herself, a woman searching for her identity and expression, but I didn't know exactly where the book was going to go. And at a certain point, I was writing the third chapter, a scene set in Siena, where Hannah encounters St. Catherine for the first time, who I think we may talk a bit about later. But I wrote that scene, and I realized that the story that I was telling in the present was bigger, and that it involved women from the past, and that what I actually wanted to write was a story that had to do with the kind of longer history of women's search for self and search for expression and relationship with their bodies.
And art plays a big role in the novel. Was that true from the beginning too, beyond like Catherine and the frescoes and everything else? But like, was the art world a place you wanted to be set in? So Hannah, and sorry, as some background to that, Hannah has worked at an art museum in Boston, which she has left and has come to Florence. And then art plays a role throughout the novel. And I was curious, related to that, about the idea of being seen and unseen. Yeah. Hannah is someone who talks a lot about being hidden, wanting to disappear, and in the course of discussing her eating disorder, talks about sculpting herself. Like, the language is very art world, like within that sense of creation. Yeah. And I was curious too about the idea of art as something that's viewed but is unchanged by viewing. It doesn't shift. So just the idea of what does it mean to be seen, both from art and from her own experiences.
Yeah. So I mean, Florence is obviously a city filled with art and filled with representations of beauty and of women, and so it made sense that it would be a major part of the book, and that Hannah, the central character, would have some history with that and be able to understand it on a deeper level. But art for her becomes a way of reflecting upon her own internal life. It becomes a way of thinking about who and what is depicted in art. People, depict what they value. So it becomes a way to think about how women have been seen and depicted and understood and misunderstood. But often it's a way for her to reflect internally. So the sculpture that I read about in the very opening is on the cover of the book, happily. It's one of my favorite sculptures in Florence. It's called The Rape of the Sabine Woman, and it is a woman who is trying to escape the grasp of this man and sort of reaching upward. And it's a beautiful sculpture, the way it twists and kind of arrives at this point, but it also, for Hannah, becomes this kind of theme. She passes it almost every day in Florence, and as somebody who is trying to escape something that might be inescapable and isn't sure where she's going, if she manages that escape, that piece of art became an important part of her experience. But many of the pieces of art in the book do.
And as did Florence, which is such an essential part to her experience. I've never been to Italy. Just out of curiosity, who here has been to Italy? My God. Wow. I'm actually now feeling very sad. I sort of thought it would be like a couple, and then I thought, we could all take a trip. But apparently y'all took a trip without me. So you maybe have more experience of Florence than I do. I had no experience of Florence. And it was such a part of the book and such a character in the book. And I know in some interviews you've had questions about what it means for an American to go abroad and to be having an experience in a city. And you too have your own history with the city. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and also about, you got a Fulbright to be working on this novel there. So what was that like? Why Florence? And perhaps you'll all recognize what she's talking about.
So I had my own history with Florence. I had studied abroad there in college and then gone back whenever I could. When I began the book, though, and got to the point where I knew the saints were going to be an important part of the book, I realized I was going to need to do more research. And so I applied for the Fulbright grant and spent the year there. I was interested in setting the book in Florence for a number of reasons. One, because it's a city that is so inspiring and that I love and admire. But also because it's a place that's filled with beauty and vitality and food, and that's very complicated for a woman who is self-starving and who is trying to figure out her relationship with beauty and with her body. It's also a place that's filled with history, though, and so Hannah is trying to escape her own history, but she runs into history around every corner, and that history includes the saints, who become such an important part of the book for her. I was also, in thinking about books that explore kind of women going abroad and finding themselves, I didn't want Florence to be the answer in the book for Hannah. It is a place that contributes to her finding her way. It's also a complicated place. It's a complicated place for women. And so all of those complications are a part of the book as well. And then finally, I did want to, Florence is a very touristed city, and it can be very difficult to get off the kind of tourist paths, but I wanted to take Hannah kind of off and below those paths. So she joins a rowing club, for example, that's below the Uffizi Gallery, that is filled with local Florentines, and she begins to develop a real relationship with the city that goes beyond her kind of initial impressions.
And we're going to talk more about the rowing, because I particularly loved the rowing aspect of it. But first, we're going to talk about the saints, because the saints are incredibly important to the novel and play a very large role. And also because today, I'm just reading so I can get the right saint, because you don't want to mess up the saints, right? Today, May 22nd, is the festival of Saint Rita, the patron saint of the abused and heartbroken, especially women who have suffered from domestic abuse. And people are out in Florence honoring her today. There's another Saint, Catherine. Obviously, I have an affinity for saints named Catherine, who plays a large role in the novel. And I want you to read another section now about Saint Catherine.
Absolutely.
To give us a taste of that, too.
So just to give you a bit of background, Hannah first encounters St. Catherine in Siena, where she runs into Catherine's mummified head, which they have in Siena, along with her finger. And they also have frescoes of her life. And one of the frescoes is of Catherine in Ecstasy, going back to art and how Hannah relates to it. And the other is of St. Catherine healing a woman possessed by demons. And so when I wrote that first scene, I began thinking about, who is possessed by God and who is possessed by demons and who decides. And Hannah, in looking at those frescoes, thinks, which one of these women am I? And so after writing that, I realized how important the saints might be to the book and began to do a bit of research. And the scene that I'm going to read here is where Hannah first begins to read about St. Catherine and to think about what she means to her. Oh, and the only other thing you need to know is that Hannah had a relationship previously in Boston with a man named Julian that ended. I visit San Frediano in Cestello, then find a small cafe not far from the church, glowing warm on this gray day. I stop for a coffee, but the place seeps in, holds me there, and I stay from early afternoon into evening, alternately reading and watching people battle the rain through the wide window. I return the next day and the day after that. The waitstaff has no qualms about my making the transition from a coffee and salad to a glass of wine when the cafe empties, and they have their staff dinner, scraping at plates and laughing, while I watch the gray light stretch across the table in shifting bands and catch in my glass. I'm reading about St. Catherine. She was born to cloth dyers, and her parents had hopes of a good marriage, but she had a vision of God at age 6, saw him quite clearly hovering above her as she walked one of Siena's narrow streets, and from then on she thought of nothing else. When she turned 12, her mother tried to take her out to be seen, to attract a husband. Instead, she shaved her head and wrapped it in a scarf. She refused visitors, slept on a board, and wore a thin, cross-covered chain with small hooks around her waist, pulling it tight so that it drew blood when she moved. Take that, is what those hooks said to her parents, her would-be suitors, the people who didn't believe her visions. Believe this. As a teenager, she pleaded to join the Mantellate, a group of older widows cloistered in the Basilica of San Domenico, but her parents refused. She was not old and was not a widow. She would be married. Until she grew ill, so ill that even when her father took her to the thermal baths, the boiling waters had no effect. Her illness was a sign from God, she said, and so her parents acquiesced, allowing her to join the widows in prayer, and Catherine was healed. Her career began with a movement inward, with visions and ecstasies. When in a trance, she did not wince at the needles that disbelievers jabbed in her feet. This and her vision of a mystical marriage to Christ secured her celebrity. As she grew older, she looked outward. She cured the lame, drew poison, and drank pus from the sores of the sick. She learned to read and became politically active, composing letters of criticism to the Pope. And she made herself empty for prayer. By age 8, she was slipping meat onto her brother's plate. By 16, she ate only fruits and vegetables, then used instruments, a stalk of fennel, a quill, to throw them back up. As another steaming dish arrives nearby, the thick, smoky smell drifting my way, my stomach turns over with desire, then revulsion, and in this, I understand the saint's denial. I remember well when my days became punctuated by sharp sensations, chills, sunlight too bright, sounds attacking, counting. And with the counting came praise, and with the praise came questions. How do you do it? A friend asked, one of a chorus when I began losing flesh. There was admiration in their voices, and I knew what they were asking. How do you cut so close to the bone? By the time Catherine joined the Mantellate, she had stopped eating almost entirely. She writes, "This body of mine remains without any food, without even a drop of water, in such sweet physical tortures as I never at any time endured." She was empty, open. I'd like to think that she belonged to no one but herself, that the sweetness of the pain was hers alone, but she writes, "My body is yours." Love. Her letters are filled with the word. The soul cannot live without loving. The soul always unites with that which it loves and is transformed by it. I envy her ecstasies, emptied of everything. Is that love? all that emptiness and the trance that follows. Love is a tunneling, I think, an envisioning and then a tunneling of vision, the edges disappearing until all that remains is the beloved. I had hoped that I would feel that with Julian, that with him I might escape the mornings when I woke, tamped down, and pressed myself back into dreams that did not soothe. But he was no match for the other solace I found. He fell away with all the rest. By the second day, I'm almost all the way through Catherine's life. The soul is always sorrowful, she writes, and cannot endure itself. Outside, people are hurrying through the rain to the evening service, and the bells begin to clang furiously, ricocheting off one another. They are playing a hymn. It is familiar to me, and I feel a rush of happiness uninterrupted. Even in this gray light, it grows, and I'm afraid of the moment when I'll slip over the peak and feel it dissipate. I close my eyes, and the bells continue, filling me with song, leaving me empty in its echo, until they begin to resemble weeping. They are asking a question. Are you searching for? Are you searching for? The sound licks at my skin, pulls me up, and for just a moment more, the bells, the words, the cloistered voices of all those pallid virgins cry within me. Thanks.
So there's so much in there that we could talk about, some of which you've discussed or hinted about the saints and about women and about power and feminism and control. But I'm going to ask just a question about ecstasy.
Sure.
Because there's another place where you write about a fresco of St. Catherine and you say, she looks upward in ecstasy, her body not her own. Ecstasy felt like me to the perfect word for the title. And then I also consulted the dictionary. Because I was curious, as I often am, like our assumptions about what words mean sometimes are not entirely true, or they do not encompass the whole of a word's meaning. And what I discovered in looking it up and then going down into my Google searching is that ecstasy can refer to visions and to the idea of like pureness or hallucination or joy, but it can also mean from a philosophical standpoint. And then Heidegger got involved and I like stopped searching, but basically, it means standing. It's like from the Greek, and again, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but it says standing outside oneself. And so I was really curious about like your choice of the word ecstasy, which comes up so much in the writings about the saints, but also in that dual or multiple understanding of like what of desire and desire that also takes very much. So I'm curious about that word.
Yeah, so thank you. That's a great question. So for Hannah, she connects with the saints in large part because of their kind of experiences with these ecstatic visions, which were fiery and sensual. I mean, and orgasmic. I mean, these women writing in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which is amazing for the time. But she connects in part with them because they practice many of them practice self-starvation. So that there's that through line, but it's primarily their kind of searches for meaning and their experiences with ecstasy that resonate with her. And for them, that ecstasy takes a religious form. It's a kind of spiritual ecstasy that is both completely fulfilling and completely emptying, and leaves them insatiable. So the opening of the book is a quote from Saint Angela, in which she says, I felt complete insatiability and at the same time complete hunger. And so Hannah connects with that part of the saint's experience as similar to what she experienced with an eating disorder, which provided its own kind of ecstasy and its own kind of high. At the same time, there's a flip side for both of them to those ecstasies, right? So while the eating disorder kind of became the center, the meaning, the church for her in a certain way, she was also literally erasing herself. And for the saints, many of them found paths to autonomy that were incredible for the time, but were also through often, as I read about, extreme behaviors. So while they were creating these identities, a part of that creation and a part of that desire was to pull away from the flesh, away from the world. And so a part of that creation was erasure as well. And so a part of Hannah's journey in the book and she gets this sort of language of understanding from the saints, but one of the things that she has to do is reject part of what they represent and not get drawn back into that kind of insatiable high.
So one of the things that helps her with that is the rowing club that she joins. And as much as Ecstasy feels like it's about extremes of emotions and kind of a dichotomy of desire, rowing gives her a centeredness. She talks about how it's the first time she feels centered, and you have to be centered to row. My only personal experience with rowing was dorm crew when I was a freshman, and we were so bad that we ran into the bushes, which is how we ended our one race, and we then never got on the river again. But I did have that experience of like knowing what it means to be, that you have to be centered and you have to work as a body, either, solo or as a group. And there's so much, rowing again feels like the perfect way for her to explore what it means to think about finding balance as opposed to operating in extremes. Also, there's a handsome Italian man who's involved in the rowing club, so I'm just saying there's that too. But how did you have you rowed yourself, and how did you set upon that as as something that you wanted to explore the physicality of her experience?
Sure. So I learned to row during my semester abroad in Florence. So for a very limited amount of time, I learned to scull. So when I came to writing this book, many years later, I had that to draw on. And I felt like for a woman who was at war with her body, it was the perfect activity, both because it makes her, as you said, you have to be completely centered and balanced and at peace with your body and at peace in your mind. Sculls are very tippy. You're incredibly vulnerable. The opportunity to both go crooked, to capsize is very real. And so it forces Hannah to find that peace within herself. There's also nowhere for her to go. She's out in a boat on the water, and she can't outrun herself. And so it also becomes a place of reflection for her. And then, as you said, the rowing club becomes a kind of anchor in her in the city. It's where she begins to be drawn into the life of the city. And so as much of parts of this book are solitary, but a lot of it are about her relationships with other people. And Italy is a highly social place, and it's a highly relational place. And so as isolated as she is, she's constantly getting shaken out of that isolation, and especially at the rowing club.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place for her to explore what community means and what relationships mean. The novel is both about her relationship with her own body, and it's also about relationships with her sister, with loved ones, with colleagues at work, with friends. And one of the things that it says to me is, so I finished this book the first time I read it when I was in the downstairs of my great aunt's house, and my great aunt has Alzheimer's. And I finished it, and I was just overcome with emotion. I was so moved by it, both not because I personally have experienced an eating disorder, nor have, people in my family have not either, but it spoke so clearly to the ways in which we all carry something broken within us. And in that moment, I was thinking about my great aunt's Alzheimer's. I was thinking about my family has struggled with addiction and mental illness. So I know some of those things, but no matter what it is, we all carry something. And there's many of the characters who carry something, whether it's a love that they thought was going to go one way and to create a family, whether it's a job that they thought, whether it's, relationships within families. So we all carry that brokenness, and you explore that really beautifully. And I think the club allows her ways into talking about that with other people. And I wondered, when you talk about, this is about, as all novels are, about a particular character and the experience that they have, but it's much more universal than that. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that universality.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the characters who becomes most important in the book is Luca, the rower,
the handsome Italian,
the handsome Italian, with whom Hannah becomes involved. But like Florence, the city, I didn't want it to be a book in which the man saves Hannah, and that's not the case. And like Hannah, Luca has his own demons, his own heartbreaks, he has a sick parent. He has the own things from his own past that he's trying to sort of survive and understand as he tries to imagine what his future looks like. And so he and Hannah coming together, like many of the people who help Hannah, are dealing with their own struggles and those pieces aren't perfect fits, and they're not people who come in as sort of entirely healthy, confident folks who are able to support Hannah, but instead they're all these kind of imperfect people who are struggling with their own problems. And in the case with her and Luca, this isn't a sort of great romance for them, but it's something that works, and they're able to, in spite of the baggage that they're carrying, and maybe because of it, be there for each other and help each other and develop something real out of that. Yeah.
And it also allows you, so Jessie works with Words Without Borders, and this is a novel that takes place in 2 languages. You don't have to read Italian, although apparently many of you do, or possibly do, or at least know some of it more than I do. I'm going to Florence soon. But it takes place in 2 languages. And for me, fiction is always in some way an act of translation, which is that you're taking a story and translating it into words on the page, which a reader then interprets. And in this case, you've chosen to leave a lot of the story that you're telling. And sorry, so too, for me, this is the translation of the experience of an illness, and what does that mean as it operates through a life. And for her, that experience is happening in 2 languages. It's happening in English and it's happening in Italian. And her Italian is decent, but certainly not fluent, nor does it go back the other way. So there's a lot that you leave untranslated, and there's also moments where the characters are exploring their inability to fully understand what words might mean, because they do not mean the same thing in all languages. And so I'm curious about how translation played a role, and why you wanted to leave some of that in Italian, and what you saw that doing in the course of the novel.
Sure, absolutely. So in the opening, Hannah is as I read, she's very isolated. She's very much alone, and she's an outsider, and she's very aware of being an outsider. And so I wanted very practically in the opening, I wanted some Italian in there because she feels confused and alienated and isolated, and I wanted that to be on the page for the reader in a way too, except for those people who read Italian fluently, I suppose. But later, the people with whom she's developing relationships are Italian. And so it was important to have the language in there, both for moments of connection and, as you said, moments of confusion. And so at one point, Luca, with whom she becomes involved, refers to her as una donna particolare, which can mean a unique woman and can also mean a strange woman. And she's not sure of how he means it, and we're not sure of how he means it. But there are lots of small moments like that where it becomes a kind of complication in her understanding, and also a way for her to reflect on what other people think of her and what she thinks of herself.
Oh, it's a beautiful way to do it. So I'm going to ask one tiny passage, a couple of paragraphs, and then I'm going to ask for audience questions. So this is my warning to all of you to prepare your question, so we don't have that awkward moment where I ask a question, everyone sits in silence while you get courage to raise your hand. So prepare your question. The moment is upon us. I wanted you to read a final passage, and this is from when Hannah first comes to the rowing club, just because I just really loved these particular, since I'm up here and I get to ask these questions, I get to ask her to read the parts that I loved especially. So these are 2 of those paragraphs. So
thanks, Katie. So this is when Stefano, who's the manager of the rowing club, is first leading Hannah through the club. Stefano leads me back inside and shows me the locker rooms, the weight rooms, then walks me down a dark, boat-lined corridor. At the end, an old man is tending to one of the skulls, laid out like a body before him. He gently polishes its bowed wooden sides. Ciao, Correggio, Stefano calls before leading me into a room crowded with rowing machines. Against one wall is a raised pool of water, 4 sliding seats balanced on its lip. For practice in the bad weather, he says. This is a special room. You know why? I look at the quiet ergometers, the placid water, our reflections in the mirrored wall, until Stefano points to the ceiling, smiling wryly. Uffizi, he says, letting me in on a secret. C'è state? Of course I smile, really smile, for the first time in days, maybe weeks. We're right below the museum. I imagine the crowds wandering the galleries above, and that could be me, had been me. And yet in a month, a day, a single afternoon, you can become something new, can become undone, but also transformed.
Love that.